This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I'm going to start again because I just got that message about the recording. So yes, this was titled Art, Artifacts and Curios in Victorian Gothic Stories. This turned out to be a much bigger project than I originally thought. And also I got excited about the Oscar Wilde connection with Bournemouth and with Russell-Cotes. So I will mainly be talking about art and a bit more about the picture of Dorian Gray than I thought I would be. I do want to, however, give a shout out to this anthology, Strange Relics, Stories of Archaeology and the Supernatural from 1895 to 1954, which has some awesome creepy stories about artifacts and curios, both from England and ones brought from elsewhere. I'd also like to say that I'm not an art historian, but the representation of visual culture and art in Gothic fiction is something that I am very interested in. And I found my recent visit to the Russell-Cotes very inspiring, as you will see from the very large number of pictures in my slides. This is probably the largest PowerPoint slide set I've ever had. It's 64 megabytes. So let's hope it all stays stable. So to begin with, to kind of think about what the Gothic is a complicated question. It's a label that's often applied to anything that's vaguely spooky, vaguely creepy. Roger Luckhurst writes that to always remember the dreamlike logic of the Gothic is likely to disarm any easy definition. So there's a lot of scholarly debate about whether it's a period of writing, whether it's a way of writing, whether it's about the content of what's been written about. I think this idea of the dreamlike logic that Luckhurst identifies is quite key. If we think about dreams, if we think about nightmares in particular, we don't just think about monsters or strange events happening. We think about the way that things from our real life are transformed into something that's unlikely, that's uncanny, that might be in connection that we don't necessarily think about in our waking moments. So disconnected events and objects and people might fit together, different timelines might converge, things might seem surreal and unlikely. And I think something that we see in these stories that I talk about is that this dreamlike aspect, this unlikeliness, this uncanniness is conveyed through art, through different objects. They have different symbolic value, but there's also the idea that the closer you look at them, the more weird and unclear perhaps they get. So instead of stories that bring clarity, that have resolution, these stories tend to end up open-ended. We're not quite sure what's happened. We're not quite sure how it all fits together, but the vibe is fairly creepy. And so in this candlestick, for instance, it might take a while to look at before you realize that there is actually a face in there. And then there's this weird hybrid woman butterfly that I found quite compelling in the Russell-Cotes. And so the term the Gothic was used in the Renaissance to describe medieval architecture from the 1150s to the 1500s. We might think of some of the bigger cathedrals in England are from that period. There's this sense of them being complicated and ornate and disorienting in terms of their size and perspective, compared to classical art, which was having a renaissance at the time, which we think about symmetry and balance and things being clear and streamlined. So the Gothic was used perhaps a bit disparagingly to look back at these medieval structures. Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto in 1764. This is a story set in the medieval period and written as if it was set in the Italian medieval period, which makes it quite a complicated read. It's to do with a castle and a curse that's been passed down through generations, and then the conditions for this curse to happen suddenly take place, and somebody gets crushed by a giant helmet falling down from a battlement, and there's a huge spooky suit of armor stalking the corridors, and there's underground cellars and escapes, and people are in love with the wrong people, and everything goes horribly wrong, essentially. And so this book, Walpole's book, is kind of evoking an 18th century view of Catholic superstition from the medieval period, and that's kind of stuck with the Gothic mode of writing. It is associated with superstition and the supernatural and the idea of a cursed legacy. So we think about excess in architecture, in language, and in aesthetic. The early Gothic writers would never use one adjective when 9 would do, for instance. But we also see this kind of looking backwards, the return of the past, the return of the repressed, whether it's literally through a ghost, for instance, whether it's takes place in ruins, whether it's some kind of psychological repression that is emerging in a violent and scary fashion. And so we associate the Gothic with terror and horror. Some of this hangs over into the Victorian period. For instance, in J.Y. Ackerman's story, The Miniature from 1853, this story hinges on being a found manuscript from an earlier period. So the story within the story uses thee and thou a lot, for instance. It's written in quite an ornate way. There's two men in love with the same woman. They find this out in the forest, in this setting of ruins, and they end up dueling about it. And these were friends who used to be really good. These were guys who used to be really good friends, but now this woman has come between them. And the plot hinges on a miniature, on a small portrait. So the narrator's friend smiled bitterly, wiped his bruised and bloody face, and slowly drew from his bosom a small miniature encircled with diamonds, which he held before my eyes. One glance was sufficient. It was a portrait of Maria. It was that face which, sleeping or waking, has haunted me these 30 years past. Villain, I cried, clutching at the portrait with my left hand, while I snatched with my right hand my sword from its sheath. You have stolen it. And so there's this sense of haunting that the narrator's not that bothered about eventually murdering his former best friend, but he's haunted by Maria. This duel comes to a bloody end, and the murdered man's ghost comes back to steal this miniature. This small portrait is imbued with all this emotional value to the extent that it can bring this man back from the grave to retrieve it. And so this is a fairly typical Gothic setup. It's looking backwards into the past. There's this sense of lingering haunting from these events. And this object, this miniature, this artistic object, is central to the plot. David Punter and, I want to say, William Byron, argue that the Victorian Gothic is marked primarily by the domestication of Gothic figures, spaces, and themes. Horrors become explicitly located within the world of the contemporary reader. So, although this looking back is still present in some stories, in other stories, things happen in the present, in the Victorian period. The Romantic Gothic villain is transformed as monks, bandits, and threatening aristocratic foreigners give way to criminals, madmen, and scientists. And so we might think of the tale, Stevenson's story about Jekyll and Hyde, for instance. The exotic and historical settings that serve to distance the horrors from the world of the reader in earlier Gothic are replaced with something more disturbingly familiar, the bourgeois domestic world or the new urban landscape. So the Gothic can happen not just in castles, not just in isolated mansions and rural places and in the wilderness. It starts to happen in people's houses, in suburbia, on the streets of London, which is supposed to be the very centre of the British Empire, the civilized world, the centre of progress. We see this Gothic dark undercurrent. And Andrew Smith and William Hughes write that the point of the domestic Gothic is that it represents a particular manifestation of the uncanny, in which the home now becomes, in Freud's terms, the site of troubled sexual secrets. So that far from guaranteeing safety, the domestic becomes the space through which trauma is generated. So there's this attack on the sanctity of the home. The idea that the Englishman's home is his castle becomes somewhat disturbing when you think that the Englishman's home becomes a Gothic castle, a structure that can't fully be enclosed, a structure that's not fully private or secure. I'd say not all the secrets that come to life are necessarily sexual secrets, though we do see violent desires and jealousy and transgressive desires emerging as well. We think about the uncanny, we think about the familiar being made unfamiliar, but it's partly that recognition that persists that gives the rise to the sensation of the uncanny. So if we see something that we know that's everyday that then becomes strange and weird, it's the fact that we still recognize the everyday in it that gives rise to what Freud calls the feeling of the uncanny. Smith writes in his book on the ghost story that the ghost story between 1840 and 1920 engages with a series of grand political debates about economics. So even on a small micro scale within these houses, we see concerns about money, national and colonial identities, and we see this in terms of art and artifacts when something strange has been brought from overseas, something that's linked to strange rituals that can't be understood, and then this starts to generate Gothic occurrences. Gender, the kind of position of women and the position of women within the household is often subverted in some ways. And then the presence of the ghostly indicates a liminality. So this kind of between space, this threshold space, which compromises models of a coherent, self-conscious and self-present conception of identity. And this happens partly through the disruption of timelines. Even if we're in the present and something strange is happening now, then it's probably due to something that happened in the past that can't fully be erased or repressed. So what does that tell us about the present moment and how we exist in the present moment? So we're thinking fairly literally about cracks in a veneer of progress and civilization, as well as cracks in the understanding of the self and the relationships with people around us. There are three main streams of Victorian Gothic. There's ghost stories, such as Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, sensation fiction, like Wilkie Collins's work, The Moonstone, The Woman in White. It's about elopements and imprisonments and entrapments and things going horribly wrong for a lot of people in a very dramatic kind of way. And then the more fin de siècle, end of the century Gothic, we think of decadent writers like Oscar Wilde's and The Picture of Dorian Gray. And throughout all of these, we get this sense of anxiety and uneasiness. All of these relate to the home and the kind of, even if not ghosts or supernatural occurrences within the home, but tensions and uneasiness within family relationships. Who has the power, who has the money, who has control, especially over young women. The Moonstone hinges on an artifact, the Moonstone brought from India, which is purportedly the eye of a god, which brings trouble with it, is said to be cursed, and unlucky things start happening within this household. And then, of course, The Picture of Dorian Gray is about painting. So throughout the Victorian Gothic and the stories I talk about, there is this sense of parallel parallel worlds, the borderland of what we can know and then what lies beyond that. And some of this was enhanced through travel, through the sense that there are borders to England, borders to the British Empire, beyond which lies the unknown. So if that's the case in the real world, then why not the spiritual world as well? And this kind of comes back to the idea of the liminal, this kind of border space. So in A Twin Identity, Edith Stewart Drury writes about a character who finds herself, she's a fairly everyday character, despite the fact she's a policewoman in Paris. She's been asked to solve this strange murder case. In doing so, she finds herself within what she calls the borderland of the real and unreal, the seen and the wondrous unseen, of which our finite humanity, the soul's prison, knows so little and conjectures so much. So there's this sense of the limits of what humans can know and then what can't be kenned, literally the uncanny beyond that. And so this belief, which we see in the Victorian popularity of seances, of spiritualism, of ways and rituals of talking with the dead, coexists with fairly conventional Christian beliefs about heaven and the afterlife. There's just this idea we see in these Gothic stories that the border between our world and the next world is something fairly flimsy. And so what happens in the stories I'm going to be talking about is that art offers a portal into this other world, whether it's the dead contacting the living through art, whether it's a cursed painting in itself. Art becomes this thing of emotional and spiritual and symbolic value that offers this lens into the Gothic. And so this can happen in what I like to call rooms of doom, for instance, interior spaces that make use of art. There's something wrong with a room. There's a reason why the servants never go there, for instance. There's a reason why nobody's ever asked to stay there, even though it's a perfectly good room. So in Lettice Galbraith's The Blue Room, for instance, this is from the point of view of a housekeeper. Oh, she's a housekeeper's daughter at this point. When my duties took me to the Blue Room, I would wonder why, if nothing had happened there and there was no real mystery, the room was never used. It had not even a mattress on the fine carved bedstead. So there we see a hint of the elaborate aesthetic of the Gothic, which is only covered by a sheet to keep it from the dust. And then I would steal into the portrait gallery to look at that great picture of the Lady Barbara, who had died in the full bloom of her youth. No one knew why, for she was just found one morning, stiff and cold, stretched across that fine bed under the blue tapestried canopy. And so here the kind of object of art is the portrait that reminds of this person who died, but also this blue tapestried canopy, this everyday object of the bed, which has been made elaborate and complicated and ornate, and which turns out to be cursed. And so the story goes on about whether this curse can be broken or whether this room is doomed to forever lead to madness and despair and death to anybody who passes the night there. In The Green Bowl by Sarah Orne Jewett, then again an everyday household object, is shown to have mysterious powers. In this case, it's a green bowl which had been brought home from some far province of China. When we first see it, it's standing on the side table between the windows with 3 yellow apples in it. So it seems like a fairly normal fruit bowl. But then it turns out to have this kind of fortune-telling capacity. The owner of the bowl uses it as other people look at crystals to tell the future. And eventually, the person who comes to have the bowl finds out something she never really should have known about or wanted to know about in the first place. That kind of power and knowledge comes at a cost. But this idea of the green bowl and it bringing it from the story set in America, but still we see this sense of collection, this sense of objects and art that come from elsewhere and create disturbance in the home. And speaking of disturbances in the home leads me to think about the picture of Dorian Gray. Oscar Wilde stayed at the Bath Hotel. He was acquainted with the Russell-Cotes. He has characters in Dorian Gray. I think there's a Lady Bournemouth and a Lady Branksome, something like that, which I found quite intriguing. Gary Schmidgall, who wrote the introduction to the edition I read most recently, says each reader must confront and attempt to resolve Dorian's enigma individually, and this requires delving behind poses, beneath masks and disguises, below the novel's exquisite surface. And I think this panel here kind of illustrates that, because it's a chandelier, right? There's a chandelier and a sort of ornate, complicated, lacquered bowl of fruit underneath, but also I see a mask. I see a face with a mask the closer I look. And then there's also this veneer and this shiny surface. So in the picture of Dorian Gray, there's a young man called Dorian Gray, who's very young and beautiful and self-obsessed, and he feels objectified. His beauty is objectified by the people around him. He's friends with a painter who wants to paint his portrait and who imbues this portrait with his own desire for Dorian as a subtext, his own very intense emotional and passionate feelings, not just about Dorian, but about art and about creation and about beauty in itself. When they view the finished portrait, it's a thing of beauty, but Dorian, under the influence of Lord Henry, a quite decadent, corrupted, very cynical connoisseur of art, society man, influences him to be troubled by this painting. Dorian says, "I'm less to you than your ivory Hermes or your silver fawn." So he thinks of himself as an artistic object rather than a person. "You will like them always. How long will you like me? Till I have my first wrinkle, I suppose. I know now that when one loses one's good looks, whatever they may be, one loses everything." So there's this emphasis on surface, on image. We might think about Instagram today and the kind of obsession with different filters or Botox, this obsession with staying young, staying fixed within a frame, within the way that we were first perceived. And then so Dorian makes this kind of pact that if he stays young and beautiful, then the portrait will reflect his life experience. But Dorian's life experience isn't particularly pleasant. He turns out to be corrupted and cynical and exploitative of the people around him, and these all start to reflect on the portrait. The Victorians were very into physiognomy, the study of faces, the idea that the character and life experience is visible in the shape and lines, shape of the head, bone structure, the kind of lines of the face, the expression of the eyes, and it's the portrait that takes on all these qualities. But Dorian also becomes an art collector. He collects art from around the world, things that are beautiful. He collects sacred objects. He collects tapestries, medieval tapestries, a lot of things that are beautiful but are also linked to violence, linked to different poisonings, come from the houses of people who have committed crimes. Even the sacred objects he collects aren't due to any kind of genuine faith or belief, but they're decontextualized, they're taken from their original settings and placed into what becomes essentially his private museum. And so I'm not suggesting at all that any kind of similar motivation applied to the Russell-Coteses, but I can see why Oscar Wilde liked their art collection. And I can see why he would have been fascinated, because there is such a wide variety of objects from around the world, objects placed into different contexts, objects that offer different perspectives on other objects when you look at them in different ways the way you go through. And I think that kind of gestures forwards to my concluding question about the Gothic Museum, is that it is this kind of space with all these different objects with different emotional values, with different backgrounds, but they're not necessarily fixed. The way we look at them, the way we go through the museum offers different perspectives. And so Dorian has all these treasures that he collects in his lovely house. And that's how he kind of escapes from this fear that comes to him, this fear that he's actually ruined his life, that he's isolated from other people, that he's done terrible things that he'll never be able to take back, and that might have some sort of consequence at some point. So while his downstairs rooms have been filled with beauty and different objects from around the world, upstairs in this lonely locked room, there's this terrible portrait whose changing features showed him the real degradation of his life behind this curtain. And so Dorian and the portrait are a fairly classic example of the Gothic double, the idea that there's a light side and a dark side, and the dark side of our own nature, our own psychology, is embodied in the double. So when we see references in Gothic stories to shadows or mirrors or reflections or portraits, that's the kind of psychological dynamic being invoked. We still see that today in films like Black Swan, for instance, where there's an innocent character playing a white swan, and then this more kind of sexualized character playing the black swan, and they come to mirror each other. So in the picture of Dorian Gray, Dorian looks at himself in a curiously carved mirror that Lord Henry had given to him so many years ago now. Lord Henry being the aristocrat who originally invited Dorian's corruption and encouraged his self-obsession, his narcissism. A narcissist, of course, being the Greek myth of somebody who looked at their reflection too long and eventually drowned in the pool they were gazing into. So we might see a sort of cautionary tale here about vanity, about self-obsession, though I'm not sure Wilde was particularly keen on cautionary tales. And the white-limbed cupids laughed round it as of old. So again, there's this sense of the elaborate, this sense of the complicated decoration, complicated object. He took it up as he had done on that night of horror when he had first noted the fatal picture, and with wild tear-timmed eyes looked into its polished shields. And then eventually he realizes that he loathed his own beauty that had ruined him, his beauty and the youth that he had prayed for. But for those two things, his life might have been free from stain. His beauty had been to him but a mask, his youth but a mockery. And so the idea of the mask, the idea that things are hidden, that are never quite what they seem, is something that comes up a lot in Gothic fiction, and also it's obviously key to the way Wilde writes and the kind of society he writes about in the picture of Dorian Gray. We see another kind of mirror moment in The Romance of Certain Old Clothes, a short story by Henry James, in which two sisters, Perdita and Rosalind, one of them's dark, one of them's fair, so there's this kind of doubling there, are in love with the same man. One afternoon, Miss Wingrave, the older sister, sat alone. Before her toilet glass, combing out her long hair, it was getting too dark. She lit the two candles in their sockets. So when I saw this mirror with a candle holder in the Russell-Cotes, I had to put this in here. Rosalind finds out that her sister has won the affections of the man they're competing over, and they're competing in a very subtle, subtexty, Henry James kind of way. If she had looked at it less abstractly, she would have seen her handsome figures subtly disfigured by jealousy. So the mirror doesn't always show us what we want to see in it. It doesn't always show us, it can show us something that we're not expecting, but we don't always look at it, right? And then after the wedding, the younger sister finds Rosalind as usual before the glass. So there's again this sense of vanity, this sense of self-obsession. She had dressed herself in Perdita's cast of wedding veil and wreath, and on her neck she had hung the full string of pearls which the young girl had received from her husband as a wedding gift. And so this mirror offers this lens for transmitting these intense emotions of jealousy, of of Rosalind wanting to be her sister, of inhabiting her sister's costume, eventually taking her sister's place, but then things work out in a very spooky and Gothic way and don't really end well. In the Ebony Frame by E. Nesbit, she alludes to the woman of the type beloved of Burne-Jones and Rossetti. This is a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti from the museum. Here, a young man has inherited his aunt's house. He finds a creepy painting in an attic, as you do, despite all the warnings of Gothic stories before 1893, which he should have been far more careful to abide by. He takes down the painting in the ebony frame. He cleans it and finds on one side a portrait of somebody who looks a lot like him in a chevalier costume from the reign of King Charles. And on the other side, he finds this beautiful woman, a woman of the type of beauty beloved of Burne-Jones and Rossetti, straight nose, low brows, full lips, thin hands, large, deep, luminous eyes. She wore a black velvet gown. It was a full-length portrait. Her arms rested on a table beside her and her head on her hands, but her face was turned full forwards, and her eyes met those of the spectator bewilderingly. On the table by her were compasses and instruments whose uses I did not know, books, a goblet, and a miscellaneous heap of papers and pens. I saw all this afterwards. I believe it was a quarter of an hour before I could turn my eyes away from hers. I have never seen any other eyes like hers. They appealed as a child's or a dog's do. They commanded as might those of an empress. So this portrait is captivating. It's almost alive. He feels this instant connection with it. What turns out later to be a clue is the presence of these compasses and instruments in the portrait. This is a woman in an era where women weren't educated, who knows things that perhaps women weren't supposed to know. And so it turns out that she'd been burned as a witch, but she'd made a pact that if she goes to hell, she can kind of stay in the portrait and re-emerge when somebody who truly loves her comes along. And so the narrator is this incarnation of her former lover. Things don't end well, and it's perhaps the case that she was actually a witch after all. But again, we see this portrait as this kind of frame into another world, into the past, into this kind of destructive legacy that affects the present. And so these are just a few of the examples from stories I came across, and I will have a list, and I think we can perhaps post it on the YouTube channel of the compilations where I have these stories from. E. Nesbit, you may know of from The Railway Children or from The Treasure Seekers. She wrote a lot of children's stories, but then she also had this collection called Grim Tales, which had these more kind of Gothic chilling tales. One of the most chilling things in this story is that the narrator ends up marrying his original sweetheart, despite the fact that he always longs for this portrait woman, and living out his life with her, but he feels that the life he's living is a dream, and the reality is the life that never happened with the portrait woman. So again, there's a sense of kind of masking, of pretending to be something you're not, of living a life that is all artifice, with this kind of destructive passion behind it. So to conclude, to kind of think about the museum Gothic, I've already mentioned the kind of the very presence of objects and art put into a context in which they can be read to communicate with each other, the way you move through the museum, as Millette suggests, of libraries, but also museums, redeem the imagination. the ghostly fragments of archives, but I would suggest also art, tempt us to empathetically piece them together, invest ourselves in them, and bridge the gap between the them then and the us now. So it's a kind of communication with the past, this kind of imaginative reconstruction of the past, perhaps. I was talking to one of the staff at the gift shop counter who told me that she's tried to count the peacocks in the portrait room, which are along the top of the wall here, along the moulding, I guess. And every time she comes up with a different number. That's a classic Gothic trope. You try to count something, but the number always changes. You're never quite sure what's there in what place. Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, wrote that museums and libraries have become heterotopias. So by that he means spaces in which a lot of different things happen, a lot of different things have a lot of different purposes coincide, in which time never stops stockpiling knowledge, and in which the accumulation of objects and books from other times are at once outside their own eras, while trapped as if an aspect always in the present. And so I think this connection between the past and present, and the kind of fluidity of that connection, is something which might gesture towards Museum Gothic. I think another thing is also the sense of staging and performance. These are objects placed in a particular way. I was intrigued by the Henry Irving exhibition and the idea that Henry Irving, the actor, inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. Also, when you look at the exhibition there behind glass, as Foucault says, it's preserved in aspic, but you don't quite know what's real and what's not. Is that a real skull, which he perhaps used to play Hamlet, or is it a stage skull? There's also a portrait of him dressed as, I think, Charles I. If you don't realise that's the portrait of an actor, you might think that was an actual portrait of Charles I. So again, there's this kind of sense of slippery identity. We don't quite know what's real, what's staged, at least the casual visitor doesn't. And things are placed in connection with each other to create a certain effect. Overall, I think the impression that I get of both the Victorian Gothic story and the museum itself is this idea from Charles Dickens's to be taken with a grain of salt, in which he becomes aware of a ghostly presence. He gets insight into the workings, the narrator gets insight into the workings of a trial that he shouldn't really have by conventional means. He says, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow. I do not know what to call it. No word I can find satisfactorily descriptive, which for Charles Dickens is quite something, in which I seem to see that bedroom passing through my room like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. And I think the relationship between the past and the present in the museum and also the Victorian Gothic story has that sense of superimposition, a picture impossibly painted on a running river. And so here are my references and further reading, which again you can possibly post. But that's all from me for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, can you see me? Thank you ever so much, Rebecca. I have to say that was so interesting that I have to say I'd never thought of the Russell-Cotes and their rooms of doom, as you call them, would be inspired by the Gothic. I think we just sort of throw out, there's lots of terms that we usually throw out, so January Renaissance, Scottish baronial, but yeah, never Victorian Gothic. So it was so interesting to see it through a different lens, as I suppose the Gothics.
As I said, I'm not an art historian.
No,
or an expert. This is just sort of my reading of the space. So I do think in the narrative tales exhibition, then there is one picture of a fortune teller and two women that I'd have wanted to talk about more. I think a lot of the pictures in themselves do have these kind of shadows and this kind of Gothic-y undertone that was really interesting.
Yeah, when you were talking about the Henry James novel, that was actually the painting that immediately sprang to mind. I hadn't heard of that book before. I didn't study English, so yeah, that was really interesting. I don't know if anybody had any questions. I think there was a couple of chats I can see.
Shall we turn off the recording?
Oh yes, let's try. I'm glad you've reminded me. Let me turn it off if I can. 2 seconds.